They were all wrong. And that single truth, 4 words spoken quietly into the dark, is the kind of truth that doesn't arrive with sirens or flashing lights or breaking news alerts. It arrives slowly, the way a cold front moves across the plains of the American Midwest, invisible and steady, until one morning you wake up and the world outside your window looks completely different from the world you thought you knew the night before. That is the kind of story we are telling today. Not the kind that shocks you in the first 5 minutes and then fades into background noise. The kind that stays with you. The kind you think about on the drive home. The kind that makes you look at the person sitting across from you at the dinner table and ask yourself quietly whether you actually know them at all. Before we go any further, Neuron, we want to hear from you. Drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because the stories we are bringing you are not the kind you want to find out about secondhand. Now, let us go back to the beginning, not to the crime, not to the courtroom, not to the moment the police tape went up and the news vans crowded the street. Let us go back to where every story like this one actually starts, which is long before anyone thought there was a story to tell at all. Let us go back to a town called Mill Haven, Ohio. Population 31,000. The kind of town that shows up in photographs of America the way America likes to imagine itself. Wide streets lined with oak trees, and a main street with a hardware store, a diner, a barber shop, and a bank that has been in the same building since 1954. Friday night high school football games, where the whole town turns out in bleachers that creak under the weight of generations, a place where people still wave at strangers from their front porches, a place where the word community still means something real. That is where Thomas Alan Garner lived, and that is where everything happened. Thomas was born in 1959 in Dayton, Ohio, the oldest of 4 children raised by a railroad worker named Earl Garner and a homemaker named Ruth Ann. By every account that has ever been given by people who knew him growing up, Thomas was the responsible one, the steady one. While other kids in the neighborhood were getting into trouble, or Thomas was delivering newspapers before dawn and saving every dollar. While his younger brothers argued and fought the way brothers do, Thomas was the one who stepped in and calmed things down. His 3rd grade teacher, in a school yearbook quote that would later be read aloud in a courthouse 3 decades later, described him as a young man with an old soul. She meant it as a compliment. Looking back, it means something else entirely. He married Carol Ann Fielding in the summer of 1983. They had met at a church social 2 years earlier, and by every account from friends who attended the wedding, they looked like the kind of couple that was built to last. Carol was warm, soft-spoken, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and kept a casserole in the freezer for when neighbors fell on hard times. Thomas was steady, dependable, the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late. They bought a house on Willowbrook Drive in Mill Haven in 1985. They had 2 children, a daughter named Susan and a son named Daniel. They attended Calvary Baptist Church every Sunday without exception. Thomas coached youth baseball for 11 consecutive seasons. He was, to every person who crossed his path, the picture of the American man who had made good on every promise life asked him to make. And here is where we have to slow down. Because when we tell stories like this one, there is always a temptation to go back through someone's life and point to all the warning signs and say, there, right there, that is where you should have known. And sometimes that exercise is fair. Sometimes the signs were real and visible and ignored. But with Thomas Garner, the people who knew him best have spent years going back through every memory they have of him, turning each one over like a stone at the bottom of a riverbed, looking for something dark underneath. And what they found, more often than not, was nothing. The performance was that complete, the mask fit that well. And that is precisely what makes this story so deeply, quietly terrifying. The man who would become the center of one of the most disturbing cases in Mill Haven's history spent the better part of 2 decades building a reputation that was, by any objective measure, genuinely impressive. He rose through the ranks at the Tri-County Insurance Group, where he had started as a junior adjuster fresh out of community college, to become regional operations manager by the time he was 41. His colleagues described him as firm but fair, while his employees, in interviews conducted years later, said that Thomas Garner was the kind of boss who remembered your kids' names and asked about them. He sent handwritten notes when someone in the office had a family loss. He organized the company's annual charity drive and consistently brought in more donations than any other regional office in the state. The man was, professionally speaking, exemplary, and that reputation was not accidental. It was constructed, maintained, and protected with a level of deliberate care that, in retrospect, tells you something important about the mind behind it. There is a neighbor named Beverly Hutchins who lived 3 houses down from the Garners on Willowbrook Drive for nearly 14 years. Beverly is in her late 60s now, and when she speaks about Thomas Garner, she does so in the careful, measured way that people speak when they are still not entirely sure how to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person a jury eventually said he was. She has described Thomas as the neighbor everyone wishes they had. He plowed her driveway in winter without being asked. He helped her son move into his first apartment. He fixed a section of her fence one Saturday morning simply because he had noticed it was leaning and had a few spare hours. There was nothing he wouldn't do for you, Beverly has said in interviews. Nothing. That was the thing. He made you feel like you mattered to him, and I genuinely believe that he meant it. She pauses every time after she says that, because now she knows that she was not the only one Thomas Garner made feel that way. And she knows that for at least one person, and though that feeling became something it was never supposed to become. Her name was Margaret Louise Holloway. She was 53 years old, a former school teacher who had retired early after a back injury and had moved to Millhaven from Columbus to be closer to her sister following a difficult divorce. Margaret was, by the accounts of everyone who knew her, the kind of woman who wore her warmth openly and without apology. She laughed easily. She cooked for people when they were struggling. She kept a garden in her backyard that she said was less about the flowers and more about the thinking she did while she was tending them. She had 2 grown children, a son in the Navy and a daughter studying nursing in Cincinnati. She had started rebuilding her life after her divorce with the quiet determination of someone who had decided that what came next was going to be better than what came before. She moved into the house at the end of Willowbrook Drive in April of 2007, and within 6 weeks of arriving on that street, she had met Thomas Garner. The relationship between Margaret Holloway and Thomas Garner began, by all accounts, in the most ordinary way imaginable. A wave over the fence, a conversation about the neighborhood, an invitation to a block party where Thomas and Carol were hosting, as they always did, with an abundance that made people feel genuinely welcomed. Margaret attended. She met Carol. She met Susan and Daniel. She met Beverly Hutchins and the Kowalski family from across the street, and the retired veteran named Harold, who walked his beagle every morning at 6. She was, according to people who were there, relaxed and happy. She told her sister that she thought she had made a good choice moving to Millhaven. She told her daughter on the phone that the people on her street were some of the kindest she had ever met. She was not wrong about the street. She was catastrophically wrong about one of the people on it. What happened between Thomas Garner and Margaret Holloway over the following 18 months is a story that exists in fragments, in pieces gathered from text messages, phone records, emails, witness accounts, and ultimately from a confession that came only after investigators had already assembled enough of the truth to make denial pointless. What those fragments tell us is this: Thomas Garner pursued Margaret Holloway with the same methodical, patient attention to detail that he brought to everything else in his life. He was helpful, he was present, he listened in the way that people who are deeply, dangerously calculating know how to listen, which is to say that he listened not just to what Margaret said, but to what she needed. And what Margaret needed, having come out of a marriage that had left her quietly hollowed out, was someone who made her feel seen. Thomas Garner was extraordinarily good at making people feel seen. It was, without question, his greatest skill and his most lethal one. By the winter of 2008, their relationship had moved well beyond neighborly. This was not a secret that was particularly well kept, despite Thomas's efforts. Carol Garner, in the years following, has spoken about the period with a kind of exhausted honesty that is heartbreaking to witness. She says she noticed things, small things, the way Thomas's phone went to a drawer when she walked into a room, the evenings that ran long when he claimed to be working late, despite the fact that his particular job could, as she knew well, almost always be done from home. The way he sometimes looked at her with an expression she could not name at the time, but has since come to recognize as the look of a man managing two entirely separate worlds and calculating, always calculating, the distance between them. Carol did not act on what she noticed. She has said in interviews that she talked herself out of what she felt because Thomas was Thomas. Because Thomas was the man everyone knew. Because Thomas did not do things like this. Because Thomas was, above all things, reliable. The cruelest part of that trust is what it cost her. Margaret Holloway's sister, a woman named Diane Pryor who lives outside Columbus, has given a number of interviews over the years about her sister and about Thomas Garner. Diane describes Margaret during this period as genuinely happy in a way she had not seen in years. She seemed lighter, Diane has said. When I visited that spring, she just seemed like herself again, like she had found her footing. Diane did not know about Thomas Garner's marriage. Margaret had not told her. Whether that omission was born of guilt, or of the particular way that people in complicated situations manage what they share with the people who love them most, Diane does not know. What she does know is that the last time she saw her sister, Margaret was smiling, and that the next time she heard Margaret's name, it was from a detective who called her on a Thursday afternoon in February of 2009 and asked if she could come to Millhaven as soon as possible. She drove 3 hours without stopping. She has never really left that phone call behind. Margaret Holloway was reported missing on February 11, 2009. The report was filed by her daughter, who had been calling her mother's cell phone for 4 days without an answer. The daughter, whose name was Tanya, had initially assumed her mother had simply been busy or had gone somewhere without mentioning it, after which Margaret occasionally did, taking short trips to visit old friends from her teaching days. But 4 days of silence was not like her. 4 days with no return calls, no texts, no activity on her email account. Nothing. Tanya drove from Cincinnati on a Wednesday evening, let herself into her mother's house with the spare key Margaret had given her, and found a home that was, in every visible way, perfectly in order. The mail had piled up on the front step. The plants on the kitchen windowsill had not been watered and had begun to droop. Margaret's reading glasses were on the kitchen table, next to a book that was open to page 214, as if she had stepped away for a moment and simply never come back. The Millhaven Police Department assigned the case to Detective Raymond Fowler, a 23-year veteran who has since retired, but who, in the years following the case's conclusion, has given a number of interviews that reveal the particular way that a seasoned investigator processes a case that begins without obvious answers. Fowler has said that the first 48 hours of the Holloway investigation were, from a procedural standpoint, unremarkable. Missing adult. No signs of violence in the home, no immediate indication of anything other than a voluntary absence. The department treated it accordingly, which meant that for the first 2 days, the investigation moved at a pace that Tanya Holloway has since described as agonizing. She knew, in the way that daughters know, that her mother had not simply left. She kept telling Detective Fowler that. Fowler, to his credit, has said in interviews that he believed her. "Some things you can't put in a report," he has said. "But I believed that girl from the first time she sat across from me." It was on the third day of the investigation that Thomas Garner's name first appeared in the case file. It appeared not because anyone suspected him, but because investigators were doing what investigators do in the early stages of a missing persons case, which is to speak to everyone in the immediate vicinity of the missing person's last known location. Willowbrook Drive, the neighbors, the people who would have seen Margaret coming and going in the days before she disappeared. Beverly Hutchins told investigators that the last time she remembered seeing Margaret was on a Sunday afternoon, when Margaret had been standing in her front yard talking to Thomas Garner. Beverly had waved at them both from her car as she pulled into her own driveway. Thomas had waved back. Margaret had smiled. Beverly had gone inside and not thought about it again until the detective knocked on her door and asked her to think back. Thomas Garner, when investigators knocked on his door on a Friday morning and asked him the same set of routine questions they were asking every neighbor on the street, was cooperative, relaxed, and deeply expressively concerned about Margaret's well-being. He said she was a wonderful neighbor. He said he hoped she was safe. He said if there was anything at all he could do to help, they should not hesitate to ask. He made coffee. He sat across from a detective in his own kitchen and did not flinch once. Detective Fowler has described that first interview with Thomas Garner in terms that have stayed with those who have heard them. He says Thomas was the kind of person who gave you everything you asked for and nothing you were looking for. Perfect answers, measured emotion, the right amount of worry without tipping over into the kind of overwrought grief that occasionally signals something practiced rather than genuine. He was good, Fowler has said simply. He was very, very good. Fowler left that first interview with nothing that justified additional scrutiny. He went back to his office and continued working through the list of neighbors and acquaintances. He followed procedures. He did his job. And for the next 11 days, Thomas Garner remained exactly what he appeared to be, a concerned neighbor on a quiet street in a small Ohio town, waiting, along with everyone else, for news about the woman who had vanished from the house at the end of the block. What shifted the direction of the investigation did not come from a dramatic breakthrough or a sudden burst of detectives' intuition. It came, the way so many turning points in cases like this one come, from something small, from something that would have been easy to overlook and that was almost overlooked entirely. One of the junior officers assigned to assist Detective Fowler was going through Margaret Holloway's phone records as part of the routine documentation process and noticed a pattern in her call history. Over the 6 months preceding her disappearance, there were repeated calls to and from a single number. The number appeared dozens of times. Long calls, late calls, early morning calls. The kind of frequency and timing that tells a story before you even know whose number it is. The officer ran the number. The name that came back was Thomas Alan Garner, and the world of the investigation changed in an instant. What followed was not a swift arrest or a clean confession or a tidy resolution of the kind that makes for satisfying television. What followed was weeks of painstaking, legally careful, methodically conducted investigative work that Fowler and his team have since described as some of the most demanding of their careers. Because Thomas Garner, when confronted with the phone records, did not panic. He did not cry. He did not lawyer up immediately, which might in itself have been telling. He acknowledged the relationship. He described it in vague, minimizing terms as a friendship that had perhaps become complicated. He expressed remorse that he had not been forthcoming about it from the start. And he said that he had not mentioned it because he did not want to cause his wife unnecessary pain during what was already a frightening situation. And then he sat back in his chair and looked at Detective Fowler with the calm, measured expression of a man who was absolutely certain that what investigators had was phone records and nothing else. He was not entirely wrong about that. Not yet. The phone records established a relationship. They did not establish a crime. Margaret Holloway was still a missing adult. Thomas Garner was still, legally speaking, a person of interest and nothing more. His attorney, a sharp and experienced man named Gerald Mace, who had been practicing criminal defense law in Ohio for over 30 years, we arrived at the Millhaven Police Department within 24 hours and made it clearly understood that his client was prepared to cooperate within the appropriate legal boundaries and that everything beyond those boundaries would require a warrant. Mace knew the law. Garner knew how to follow instructions. And for a period that lasted just over 3 weeks, the investigation reached what Fowler has described simply as a wall. They knew something had happened. They could feel in the specific way that people who have spent their lives working these cases feel things that Thomas Garner was the answer to the question of where Margaret Holloway was. But feeling and proving are two entirely different jurisdictions. And Thomas Garner knew exactly where the line between them was drawn. It was Margaret's daughter Tanya who, in ways she could not have known at the time, helped investigators find what they needed. Tanya had spent the weeks following her mother's disappearance doing what grieving, frightened family members sometimes do, which is to immerse herself in every detail she could find about her mother's recent life, searching for something that might explain the inexplicable. She went through her mother's email. She went through the notebook Margaret kept by her bedside, which was filled with the kind of ordinary daily notations that become unbearable to read when the person who wrote them is gone. Grocery lists, appointments, phone numbers, observations about her garden. And then tucked between 2 pages near the back of the notebook, a folded piece of paper that Margaret had clearly been using as a bookmark and that contained a string of notes in her own handwriting. Dates, times, descriptions of conversations, Descriptions of things that had been said and done that did not match what she was being told. Tanya could not make full sense of what she was reading, but she brought it to Detective Fowler. And Fowler, after reading it carefully, called his team together and told them that the wall had a door in it. The details contained in Margaret Holloway's notes will not be reproduced here in full, because portions of them remain part of sealed court records. What can be said is that Margaret, in the months before she disappeared, had developed suspicions about Thomas Garner that went beyond the complications of their personal relationship. She had begun to notice discrepancies, things that did not add up, stories that changed slightly between tellings in ways that seemed small in isolation, but accumulated into something she could no longer dismiss. She had, in the quiet, methodical way of a former school teacher who had spent decades training her attention on detail, begun to investigate on her own. What she had uncovered and what she had written down in that notebook in the careful handwriting of a woman who wanted a record to exist somewhere pointed toward a past that Thomas Garner had spent years burying, a past that included a previous life, a previous name, and at least one previous situation from which Thomas Garner had walked away clean by virtue of the fact that no one had ever thought to look at him too closely. The details of Thomas Garner's past, and as investigators began to pull them into the light, were not the stuff of dramatic criminal legend. They were something almost worse than that. They were ordinary, a fraud case in Indiana from the early 1990s that had been settled quietly because the victim, a former business partner named Carl Whitmore, had accepted a financial arrangement rather than press charges. A civil lawsuit in Kentucky from 1998 that had been filed by a woman who claimed Thomas had misrepresented himself to her in a way that had cost her significant money and caused her significant harm, and that had been dismissed on a procedural technicality before it ever reached a jury. A name change, legally executed, that had occurred in 1996, and that Thomas had never mentioned to his wife, his employer, his church, or a single person in the life he had built in Millhaven. And these were not the records of a monster. They were the records of a man who had learned very early that people believe what they see in front of them, that a warm handshake and a ready smile and an unfailing willingness to be helpful creates a kind of credit with the people around you that can be drawn upon in ways those people never expect and would never allow if they understood what was happening. The arrest of Thomas Alan Garner occurred on a Wednesday morning in late March of 2009. He was taken into custody outside his workplace, at the edge of the parking lot of the Tri-County Insurance Group's regional office, in full view of several of his employees who had arrived early and were standing outside with their coffee. Accounts from people who witnessed the arrest describe Thomas's demeanor in terms that have become, in the years since, one of the most frequently referenced details of the entire case. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not appear shocked or overwhelmed. He handed his briefcase to the man standing next to him, as if he were simply stepping away for a moment and expected to be right back. He held his hands out in front of him with a calm that the arresting officer would later describe as the most unsettling thing I have ever seen in 22 years of doing this job. And he walked to the police vehicle without a single word. Margaret Holloway's body was found 3 days later on a stretch of rural property in Hardin County, approximately 40 miles outside Millhaven. The property had been owned under a name that investigators had to trace through 3 different layers of documentation, and by a shell company that Thomas Garner had established in 2004. He had purchased it quietly, paid cash for the taxes every year, and told no one it existed. Not his wife, not his attorney, not anyone. It was, investigators concluded, a contingency, a place held in reserve for a need that had not yet arisen. The level of foresight required to maintain something like that for years while living what appeared to be an entirely normal life is the kind of detail that tends to silence a room when it is read aloud. Because it means the version of Thomas Garner that Millhaven had known, the baseball coach and the casserole bringer and the driveway plower, was never a man who had simply made a terrible decision in a terrible moment. He was something far more deliberate than that. He was a man who had always, somewhere in the architecture of his thinking, maintained a room that no one else was allowed to enter. The trial of Thomas Alan Garner began in November of 2009 and lasted 22 days. Gerald Mace mounted a defense that was, by the accounts of legal observers who covered the proceedings, as thorough and strategically intelligent as the evidence allowed. He challenged the chain of custody on several pieces of physical evidence. He introduced expert testimony regarding the reliability of the documentation that Margaret had left in her notebook. He worked methodically to introduce doubt in the 12 people sitting in the jury box, and for stretches of the proceedings, particularly in the early days, court observers noted that Mace was making inroads. Thomas Garner sat at the defense table every day in a pressed suit with his hands folded in front of him, and his expression arranged in a way that several jurors would later describe as unreadable. Not angry, not frightened, not remorseful, just present, watching, calculating always the distance between where he was and where he needed to be. What broke the defense was not a single dramatic revelation, but an accumulation of detail that, by the time the prosecution finished presenting it, had created a portrait so complete and so damning that no amount of procedural challenge could obscure it. The phone records, the property records, the Indiana fraud case and the Kentucky civil suit admitted as evidence of pattern and practice. The testimony of Carl Whitmore, the former business partner from Indiana, who flew to Ohio and sat in the witness chair and described a man who had operated in his life for 3 years with the ease and comfort of someone entirely accustomed to deception. The testimony of Carol Garner, who took the stand on day 14 and who has said in interviews since that it was the hardest thing she has ever done, not because of what she revealed, but because of the way her husband sat across the courtroom and looked at her while she spoke. He did not look away. He did not show guilt. He simply watched her as if she were a variable he was factoring into a calculation. Carol Garner looked at the jury instead of her husband. She answered every question in a clear, steady voice. She said that the man she had been married to for 26 years was a stranger to her. She said that she believed he had always been a stranger to her. And she said that the worst part was not what he had done. The worst part was that she could not find a single moment, going back across all those years, where she was certain that anything had been real. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. The verdict was guilty on all counts. Thomas Alan Garner received a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 50 years old at the time of sentencing. He has never given an interview. He has never written a public statement. He has, by all accounts from the Ohio Department of Corrections, adapted to prison life with the same calm efficiency with which he adapted to everything else. His daughter Susan has not visited him. His son Daniel issued a single public statement following the verdict and has not spoken about the case since. Carol Garner filed for divorce before the trial concluded. She has since moved away from Millhaven and has spoken in only a limited number of interviews, always carefully, always with the measured quality of someone who has decided that the story of Thomas Garner will not be the final thing that defines her life. That is a decision that requires a particular kind of courage, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that simply keeps moving. Tanya Holloway has become, in the years since her mother's death, an advocate for missing persons, families navigating law enforcement systems that were not originally designed with their needs in mind. She has spoken at conferences. She has worked with legislators in Ohio on reforms to the protocols governing missing adults investigations. She carries her mother's notebook with her, she has said, not as an artifact of grief, but as a reminder of the kind of attention her mother brought to the world around her. Margaret Holloway noticed things. Margaret wrote things down. Margaret left behind a record that told the truth, even when the people around her were being told a lie. Tanya has said, in the way that people say things that have been refined through years of living with their weight, that her mother's instincts were right from the beginning, that Margaret had seen something in Thomas Garner that she could not yet name, but that she refused to ignore. And that the lesson she carries from her mother's life is not about the darkness that some people carry hidden inside them, but about the importance of trusting what you feel when something does not fit. When a story has edges that do not line up, when a person's warmth arrives too perfectly, too consistently, too arranged. Detective Raymond Fowler, now retired and living in southern Ohio with his wife of 38 years, keeps a photograph on the wall of his home office. It is a photograph of Willowbrook Drive taken in the summer of 2007, 2 years before everything happened. In the photograph, the street is sun-drenched and still. There are bicycles on lawns, an American flag on a porch, and at the far end of the block, just barely visible, two figures standing in conversation beside a garden fence. One of them is Margaret Holloway. The other is Thomas Garner. Neither of them is looking at the camera. Fowler has said that he keeps the photograph not to remind himself of the case, but to remind himself of something broader. He says that in his career, he arrested men who looked dangerous. Men who carried their intentions on the surface of them in ways that made his job, in one specific sense, straightforward. Thomas Garner was not that kind of man. Thomas Garner looked like the street he lived on. He looked like the life he had built. He looked in every way that a person can look, like someone you could trust completely. That photograph, Fowler has said, is the most honest thing about the whole case. Because if you look at it without knowing what you know, you see nothing wrong. You see a nice street on a summer day. And that is exactly what he wanted everyone to see. Beverly Hutchins still lives on Willowbrook Drive. She has said that she considered moving after the trial, but ultimately decided to stay because leaving felt like allowing what happened to take more than it had already taken. She has said that the street is different now, not in any visible way, but in the way that places are different when they have held something heavy. She says her neighbors are still good people. She says she still waves at everyone she passes. But she also says that she does not take for granted anymore the meaning she assigns to a wave or a smile or a casserole left on a doorstep. She says she learned from Thomas Garner that warmth can be a language that some people speak without feeling any of what the words are supposed to mean. And she says that what she holds on to, what she chooses to hold on to, is Margaret. Margaret's garden, which the house's new owners have maintained beautifully. Margaret's laugh, which Beverly says she can still hear clearly if she closes her eyes. The specific way Margaret had of listening to you that made you feel like what you were saying was the most important thing happening in the world at that moment. That, Beverly says, was not performed. That was real. And no verdict and no prison sentence and no amount of time will ever make real and perform the same thing. Thomas Alan Garner is currently serving his sentence at a correctional facility in Central Ohio. He is 64 years old. In the 15 years since his conviction, the case has been studied in criminal psychology programs, referenced in law enforcement training materials, and revisited by journalists and documentary filmmakers who have found in it a particular kind of instructive dread. Not because it is the worst case ever prosecuted in the state of Ohio, not because the details are the most extreme or the circumstances the most complex, but because of the question it refuses to stop asking. The question that Detective Fowler's photograph asks every time he looks at it. The question that Tanya carries in her mother's notebook. The question that Beverly Hutchins returns to every time she waves at a neighbor she thinks she knows. How well do we know the people standing right next to us? How much of what we believe about someone is what they have shown us, and how much is what we have chosen to see? And if a man can coach Little League and plow driveways and make everyone around him feel genuinely cared for, all while maintaining, somewhere deep and cold and compartmentalized, a capacity for the worst thing a person can do to another, then what exactly are we relying on when we decide to trust someone? What are we really reading when we look another person in the eye and decide, yes, this one is safe? There is no comfortable answer to that question. There is no three-step guide or checklist or piece of advice that closes it cleanly. And anyone who tells you otherwise has not been paying close enough attention to cases like this one. What there is, perhaps, is Margaret Holloway's notebook, the act of it, the impulse behind it, the decision of a woman who felt something that did not add up, and instead of talking herself out of it, either wrote it down, watched carefully, paid attention, trusted the part of herself that said something is not right here, even when everything visible said otherwise. She was not wrong. She was not confused or paranoid or difficult. She was paying the kind of attention that the Thomas Garners of the world count on the rest of us not to pay. And while that attention did not save her, it told the truth. It created a record. It helped put a man where he belongs and gave her daughter something to carry forward into a life spent making sure that what happened to Margaret Holloway happens to fewer people than it might otherwise. That is not a small thing. In a story with as much darkness as this one carries, it is, in fact, everything. The truth has a way of outlasting the people who try to bury it. The notes in the notebook outlasted the man who thought he had left nothing behind. The records outlasted the false name. The memory of Margaret Holloway outlasted every carefully constructed version of Thomas Garner that he had spent his life building and protecting. And somewhere in that outcome, imperfect and painful and costly as it is, there is something that holds, something that does not flinch when the light is turned on, something that, unlike the man at the center of this story, is entirely unambiguously real. That is what we are left with. And for today, that is where we leave you. If this story affected you in the way it affected us in putting it together, leave a comment below. We want to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and what it is about cases like this one that stays with you. So, because the conversation in the comments is always one of the most powerful parts of what we do here. Do not forget to subscribe if you have not already and hit the notification bell, because the story we are bringing you next time is one that, if you thought this one was difficult to process, will reach even further into the questions we all carry about trust, about identity, and about the lives people live when no one is looking. We will see you there.